So we're all assembled. Yes, I'm Taylor Louden. We've been doing a design roundtable as part of the CPF annual conferences for a number of years now. We've even done some remote, although it's a little, are now part of a design review panel, whether they like it or not. And they will be bringing their own particular opinions on particular projects as if they were actual on a design review panel. So they'll be speaking about whether it's the architectural or the landscape or the cultural significance or what. So this is our opening slide, which is to remind everybody that we're in Claremont. And let's see. And here we are, in no particular order. You don't have to stand up and wait, but everybody knows who you are by now. Paul Brockhurst, David Scher, Alan Hess, Barbara Lamprecht, Margaret Jarabek, and Stephen Kalin, and I will be your moderator and annoying person with a clicker. Great. So everybody in this room is familiar with the Secretary of the Interior standards for architectural rehabilitation in this case, I assume. If you're not, it's one of the fundamental guidelines, but not requirements, that historical architects like myself and most of the people in this room would have to deal with. And we're going to focus on character as one of the terms that is brought up constantly in this context. Standard rehabilitation, there are 10. We put 3 here, but one in particular, number 2, uses character. The historic character of a property will be retained and preserved. That's the or else clause. The removal of distinctive materials, et cetera, that characterize a property will be avoided. So it's embodied within the standards of rehabilitation that character is an important, and character defining feature is an important aspect of what you are looking at and what is your approach in a preservation project, or if you're in design review, what are you trying to achieve? This we'll get to at the conclusion. This is sort of a teaser for it, but this is in this case, it's Pomona's Downtown Mall and Civic Center from 1962. And the point of this, it's not only the site and making a downtown mall, but it's almost the rendering places this in the modern era context as much as anything else. Our opening project here, and this is sort of giving away the show here, but this was already been saved, but this is how probably many people, and I would be one, first heard about this building, was a Save This Building campaign from about 10 years ago. And this is the Palm Springs Bank. It was the Santa Fe Savings Bank. And it had a particular threat to it, which came in terms of this project that's on the lower left. And an opinion from the Valley Voice, which had such things as a hulking monstrosity about to leap over onto this poor building, which was defamed by a parking lot turned into a public seating area. However, it came to be, it's a 4-story building that you're seeing there, and if I can make the pointer work, I believe that is the bank building. And this was roundly criticized, although it was approved 4-1 by the local planning folks. This did turn out well, and fortunately for everybody. These are the particulars of the design itself. On the left, you will see the original site plan. On the right, how it was redone with a bit more trees, just different, and there is a perspective to come of that. The other real modification of this, and we have before and during and after pictures, has to do more with the basement than anything else, but the basement did require a new exit, which would have come up in the landscaping in there. This is the building as it existed from the 1960 redo, and that's that plan. And then the idea with this, once it was saved from being, disfigured from an addition, was to make it into a Palm Springs Museum, which was, in this case, architecture and design. The only really significant difference is the addition of that elevator. Other than that, they removed, of course, the banking counters because you didn't need that. That's the landscaping shots that we have from the submittal to CPF's design awards. This on the, I think I can pretty much read the dates, 1962, original construction. By the time it had gotten into the what do we do with this empty building, 2011 on the left, and then how this was reimagined and adaptively reused as a museum. Just to continue it out, this was the part of the open plan office area on the left in 62, and on its way into being a museum on the right. From the outside, you can see what happens in landscape. The trees grow, and we have that as the concluding slide. So I think the initial question to our illustrious panelists here are, was this a project that was successful from the Secretary of the Interior standards? Was it successful in terms of the building, in terms of the site, and in terms of how it was repurposed? I mean, in theory, it's an open plan office space that is still an open plan office space, although it was substantially modified in terms of the entrance area and with a elevator. So if this was being presented to the review board, how would you review this? Would you review it as a successful adaptive reuse? How else would you use, and bank buildings, obviously the savings and loan and Millard Sheets work will be getting to that in a bit. How do we believe that this project succeeds or fails with the Secretary standards?
There's a microphone up front. Go ahead.
And it's being aimed at Barbara.
Apparently, yeah, I didn't ask for this. Well, it certainly acquits all the requisite 7 aspects of integrity, and it continues character-defining features on the exterior, and principal interior character-defining features on the interior. I can't really speak to the landscaping. I don't know enough about it. There certainly was an orthogonal quality, but the spatial relationships of the landscape to the structure haven't changed. So those are my comments.
I think we have a landscape comment as a result.
Yeah, the drawing of showing the landscape,
which would be there. Or you mean
the
site
original.
plan?
It's, yeah, so
Regular.
I think that these were planned to be olive trees in this sort of upside down L shape that surrounded the building, and so that's changed. But I don't think I think they were olive trees underplanted with jasmine or something, and juniper. Yeah, I think they might have served a purpose for the bank. You know, it's hard to say, but yeah, that's changed. So I'm not sure. I think, it's compromise. It's not the end of the world, though. I don't think that they were there existing at the time this was rehabilitated, so they didn't remove any historic character to do this.
Do you think that the design of the landscape as it relates to the building, in other words, the whole plan concept of the whole, is still apparent, or do you think that the modified landscape design detracts in any way from the design concept of the building? Because it looks to me that there are differences in the design of the new landscape.
It's a new landscape. It
Yeah.
doesn't really reference the old, from what I can see.
I agree.
It's a contemporary landscape.
Right.
It isn't
Right.
really, I don't know if E. Stuart Williams did this, or he often worked with David Hamilton. So I don't think that, there aren't that many cultural landscape reports that have been done on modern landscapes or restorations of modern landscapes. It's still the stepchild of this, that there hasn't been the same attention to detail that has been put into the architecture. It isn't as important yet.
So one of the things that I'm always concerned about when we're doing projects is looking at integrity. So the 7 aspects in design is one, and what design is often made up of materials.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the standards where, does it comply with the intent of the standards with regard to retaining the character-defining features and also the design. So I think that in terms of the landscape, from my perspective, it is a new contemporary landscape. While it may not detract, because maybe the landscape wasn't even there, may not detract from the architecture, but it certainly doesn't restore the landscape.
It doesn't, and it doesn't work in the same way that it was intended to work with the building.
We have a comment from people online that's reminding us to please use our mics when we're making comments so they can hear us.
One thing that is absolutely true of the Secretary Standards is that it does not say specifically structure or building or form. It talks about generic in terms of site or context. So if you read the definitions, it's as broad as it can be.
Which is why a historic structures report or a cultural landscape report can really get into the detail of that sort of thing. But I don't know that that was done here.
Right, and this is sort of a difficult site. Obviously, it's got building and it's got parking and not a lot else. So the way the landscape form looks like it's done is to pretty much fill around the edges and to frame it. And it's just interesting how they framed it really differently in terms of where they place trees in that side of the structure as opposed to the other. And that faces south, I think, in that direction.
That is south, yeah.
Any other comments on this?
Just that it's interesting that the asymmetry of the building is tempered or offset or complemented by the orthogonal regularity of those trees. And in contrast, you have kind of more of a forest, savanna, plain woodland, these discrete little elements that are grouped and bunched. That's it.
One other thing, just from looking at the perspectives, is, and the exterior shot of that, which is there, is how you can use trees as a chronology to when was it taken, what was the building looking like at that time. And, however, whoops, I meant to go to the pointer. However, the entry sign was, and then somebody decided, well, we really need a handrail there, which I'm sure they did, but somehow they dispensed with the handrail in the final. So in a way, it was restoring the 1962. So get this sooner or later. What we have next up is a little bit more definition from standards 9 and 10. Somehow I think they should have Roman numerals, I don't know why. Again, in standard 9, and these are considered to be the two, or maybe standard 9 is the most impenetrable standard just in terms of syntax and what it tells you must do and what it gets into the soft fuzzy stuff. But again, it uses the word characterize the property. So we're looking back at what's the character of the property. And that's really specific. It will not destroy historic materials, features, spatial relationships. But the new work will be differentiated from the old and will be compatible with historic materials. This gets into the, well, how is it similar but different? Is it at a molecular level? Is it the way the National Park Service figured out what was the historic era of the Independence Hall? It was by dating the nails that were used in terms of what was a cut nail and what was a manufactured nail. Who makes this determination, and how subjective are the review criteria that are being used? And what about any more detail than just a very generic 2-sentence, 1 paragraph that pretty much defines is what you are doing correct or not, or defensible or not? And of course, I hope you are familiar with the preservation briefs, but the one in particular, number 14, again, talks about the exterior additions to buildings, but it also, beyond that, talks about the issues of, can you enlarge a historic building for new use without destroying its historic character? So again, we get back to the character term, and we'll be going back to that in the rest of this presentation. But also, what is significant about each particular building that should be preserved? And again, because this one in particular addresses historic buildings with exterior additions, this is just a little lead-in infomercial to the Eric Gunnar Asplund, which if you're not familiar with it, it was about a quarter century in the making, and from when it was initially expanded, the Usborne's design was in a kind of a neoclassical style. What he ended up with, and there's the original drawing from the Museum of Modern Art, actually in New York, of the connection between the two. And there's often a discussion in the standards about making a hyphen, which I think this is the ultimate definition of a hyphen, where it is really an addition to the building. It's no longer a symmetrical building, but does it need to be? Not really. And when you look at these drawings, the interior is dramatically different in the new edition. It's very modern, given it was done in 1937, as opposed to the early 20th century original law courts on the left. So with that, we can go directly to the next project, which some people who are on the jury might have to leave the room or put a bag over their head because they're involved with a cultural resource survey on the site. This is, again, one of these help save this important landmark building. In this case, it's the Lytton Savings on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. And they have a very catchy logo, which uses the original drawing, which you see of the elevation of this on the left. What we have here are a series of photographs from Jules Schulman that show the building in its folded plate glory, a real charm of the building. And even more interestingly, the context shot on the right, also by Schulman, which shows, which you can barely read, a plush pup restaurant with its own 3-bay folded plate roof. So again, in terms of context, this would be associated with the folded plate roof of the bank itself. It's also a context, although it's across the street, how it's being referential. So this makes it be more of a challenge for how do you define the context and what does the context include. On the left, 2 views of it, and one with it becoming most recently a Chase Bank. At least it's just a small blue border that was painted. So what do you do with the site? This was from about 2014, and you're looking at, this is the property itself, tower, mid-rise tower, and a big landscaped area. This is a sort of a mixed-use development, and right across the street, a movie theater mixed-use development. And that is Sunset Boulevard as it goes to there. It was the Marlboro Man ad that everybody knows. This is what was proposed for the site once you remove the folded plate building. This became rather controversial, and of course the Friends of the Lytton Savings came along, and this became, I think, controversial enough that they decided, well, let's just not proceed with this, although this did go as far as an initial study, as far as I'm aware. Then we throw Frank Gehry the scheme to see what Frank would do. Maybe to make it a little bit more contextual, not really, but maybe more of a smaller scale, possibly. And no matter what, when you look at it in the site context or model, it's still a rather different structure. The thing that I think Gehry was criticized for, as was the previous scheme, is why can't you include this nice little building somehow into the footprint of that? So the question would be, except for somebody who can't speak about the project, what rises to the level of significance with the folded plate roof bank, or for that matter, the plush pup on the right, which apparently still exists, and the folded plate still exists, although it's hidden behind the 1980s facade. So it's not so much a judgment, at least in my case, about is it a Frank Gehry project or is it an anonymous architect that has become a rather huge building? Which of those is better? I think it's more of a question of how and why and should one incorporate at least one, if not both of the folded plate roofs into this new development. And if you did so, would it in fact be conforming to the rehab standards? We're all speechless here because this is way too big to get head around. But Alan will kick it off. Thank you, Alan.
Well, I don't know. Sitting here, all I can think is something that probably everybody in this room would, just completely agree with. which is that you should save a historic building. And there are any number of reasons why you should, by default, at least start with keeping a historic building, especially one as distinguished as this. Kurt Meyer was the architect of it. And as you go around it, the art that was included in it, the form, the signage, landscaping, etc., is a really fine piece of design. The ultimate, for a city, the ultimate purpose, I would think, would be to maintain or improve the quality of the urban fabric for any number of good reasons. And maintaining a good piece of modern architecture like this would fit that bill. I think this is, frankly, a failure of the architecture profession, of which I am one, which in general does not really accept historic preservation as a default mode to go to, not the first step that most architects might take. Most architects are developers, perhaps, as well. There are any number of things that could be done with this, especially by an architect as talented as Frank Gehry, to incorporate this fabric into something new, even something larger, and to do it well. And yet that opportunity has been completely avoided. Why? I would only say that it's the culture of the architecture profession, which doesn't really even think about starting with maintaining a historic building. So that's where I stand.
I'm going to point out a landscape issue here. Besides the fact that to the south of this property, which you can kind of see, at least in the background there, it's mostly low-scale not mixed use, but multifamily housing. And Frank has sort of spread landscaping throughout along the sidewalks, along on the different roofs and roof gardens, which I'd love to know how we make that work long term. But also in terms of here, the way that palm trees are used to sort of intermediate the scale so that you have this big, tall couple of stories, and then the trees will hide the floors above sort of idea. But also just how, when you look at the landscape, that is, I think, the entirety of the plaza facing Sunset, which is where the Lytton Bank is. It's not exactly a quiet place. That's Crescent Heights Boulevard and that's Sunset Boulevard. So how anybody would stand there or sit there besides they were waiting for a bus, I can't imagine it ever being used. So I believe that's also where the Lytton Bank is right around there.
I'd also point out that immediately across Crescent Heights to the right was the original site of Googie's coffee shop. And I showed a slide earlier of Googie's, which was actually, the car would have been in front of the Lytton building if it had been built then. I don't know when it was built. And so we have a larger historic context, which of course has been eroded, again, because of past decisions as well. I would say that when that large multi-use shopping center and theater was built on the site of Googie's and Schwab's, if they had, again, taken the attitude of using historic buildings, incorporating historic buildings, being inspired by historic buildings, they would have come up with something much better there as well, which of course is what I'm proposing for this site as well.
Thank you, Alan. Any other comments, and any comments from the general public out there in the vast background area?
If I can do this. Do you mind walking up? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I think I had to step out for a phone call briefly, so I missed the very beginning of this. But I think it's really going to come down to the fact, as I think Alan kind of nailed it when he talked about the culture. I mean, architects are both on the forefront and on the front lines of historic preservation, and they're also the worst offenders when it comes to historic preservation. So in this case, the real question is, as you said, why was there not a more sensitive, at least look at it to see how something could work? And it has to do with the scale, it has to do with the size of the project, it has to do with the objectives of the project and with their meta. We could start with something like that. If you could start with trying to incorporate it in some way. And this again, I think it gets interesting without getting into this, of course, between architects. I don't know enough about Gehry's relationship with Meyer. I don't know what Gehry was on record as saying regarding the Meyer's building here, but I don't think it was very, it was great what he said about it. So the question is, we're starting with a place where there's, as you said, there's kind of a disconnect to begin with.
Anybody else on the panel? So if one were to require something like, well, no, you nominate as an HCM, historical cultural monument, you have to incorporate it into, would that detract because the context is so changed by something that would be 15 or 16 stories that's about 30 feet behind? So then you get into how do you document the context, how do you document the building, how do you preserve and maintain it even if it's ephemeral, like it's now gone, the chalk outline around the dead body theory. So, and that really isn't, yes?
I have a kid in my lap, so I apologize for not standing. Let's talk about context for a moment. Whether my personal feelings about the actual design of the project, because I am an architect and I am a historic architect. I've been in practice for many years. I'm now the president of a firm that is almost 70 years old. My father, William Bray, started the firm and practiced until he was 93 when he passed on. This project, in and of itself, has great critical errors. However, you're talking about context and you're knocking the fact that it's overbuilt, and I have feelings about that as well. I'm in sympathy with you. But since we're looking into history, since this is a historical organization, let's walk along a brief hypothetical path. Perhaps before that beautiful building, in my opinion, by Kurt Meyer and his partner, was built, maybe there was a small mom and pop store. You guys know better than I do. I haven't researched this. But if we were talking about it then, we'd say, this is monster. You're building a monster here, and we have this wonderful mom and pop store here. This is where we should do what we should be. And I think we'd be repeating history now if we had done that then. So, our personal feelings aside, and I have many in sympathy with you, if you're talking about context, let's keep our perspective.
Thank you.
And I think somebody's going to add that it's the Garden of Allah, previous site of garden.
The point you made is well taken. The site was previously the Gardens of Allah, which was kind of a Hollywood hotel hangout with a beautiful landscape and architecture to match, and was a cultural destination.
And the subject of the Big Yellow Taxi song by one Joni Mitchell, but that's another context.
Yeah, so this is quite a contextual location, and your point is well taken.
Which, of course, contradicts the idea that LA has no history, because on this site we have at least 3 layers of really significant pieces of architecture which we're having to deal with in one way or another.
And if one wanted to go way overboard with Frank Gehry's scheme, it's sort of a restatement of the Garden of Allah in terms of landscaping throughout, except maybe up to the penthouse level. Hanging Babylon.
And before the Garden of Allah? Could not my hypotheses apply then as well?
Well, yes, I think we're agreeing that the context goes throughout.
Of an idea, not in terms of historical precedent. You've changed the nature of my question. Thank you. From an architect to an architect. Architects do respect the past. In every profession, there are deviations. And that's to be expected. We live in a free country. Now, we don't just pan a group because certain individuals act that way, I believe. What was before the Garden of Allah? Was it something smaller? Probably. Was something smaller before that? Probably. So the criteria, the fact that it's larger, I don't think most architects, unless they're getting a square per foot, have a contract that they make money how big the project is. I think most architects would agree with you. However, they have to work for a developer who has to meet very stringent city requirements, state requirements, and they have to make money. That's why the developers generally are in business, unless they're predominantly wealthy people that just like to create wonderful things like the, where did your daughter perform? The Carnegie Hall. If everyone was a Carnegie Hall, Andrew Carnegie building buildings for the sheer beauty of it, and he did it for his wife, who was performing in her group. Then, I believe, if one really wants to look at context, they have to consider all factors rather than just point to 2 or 3 and say this building or this group of buildings or this project's bad because of this and that, and stop it there. I believe that we're given the opportunity to look farther and create more by looking farther, and then reasoning with the people in charge of these projects that are actually working on the projects, both in front of the counter and behind the counter at City Hall. I think with that perspective, I think we'll go a lot farther than just commiserating. I really do. Because of our education, because of who we are.
Thank you. We're going to have to move along to the next one in the interest of time. And this happens to be a case study, and I'm not going to really present it. It's going to be Barbara who's presenting this, because this is a Theodore Crowley residence, but it's led into by, so where is the architecture and everyday modernism? So with that, Barbara is on the hook. That's the forward and back, and the pointer is the big one.
Forward, okay. Forward and back.
That one.
And forward is, okay. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about not a pedigreed piece of architecture. William Worcester was the subject of a book by Mark Tribe called The Everyday Modernism of William Worcester. And others, including Stephen and others, have made the point about the simple framework, Alan, especially that Worcester embodied in his work. And so when we're looking at a piece of architecture that is not a particular purebred version of modernism, how do we go about discerning what those character defining features are? What clues do the buildings provide to us? Oops. I'll get there eventually. Okay. So one of the things that intrigued me was Stephen's comment about Christopher Tunnard and his comment on style has no place, I believe, right? 1938. And it's interesting to me that architects, as a tribe, loathe the word style. And I collected some quotes from various architects. The picture frame and not the picture, meaning architecture frames the life, it is not the life. We had no style, only good architecture. That's a very kind of defensive, style. It's good architecture. And Lautner's biting, scathing comment, right? Style is really for people who know nothing about architecture. And then the last, meaning that's what you cling to, right? When you don't understand the architecture, cling to style is what Lautner is saying. And of course, Neutra is much more bombastic and fulsome, and he says, how little does the mere stylistic penetrate into the core and heart of our organic responsiveness? He's got whole pages on what style means and how inappropriate. In fact, international style, he said that's no style at all. The only international style is classicism, because it's everywhere and throughout history. That's an international style. So, however, my main point is that there's a contradiction here, right? Because as preservation consultant and as historical architects, we work in a context of, in every National Register application, there's what style is it? And you've got your categories that you can choose from, and that's it. So we're always looking, right, at character defining features within a certain style. And so many of us who are academically trained, or even not, might find there's an inherent contradiction, right, between what we use in a regulatory environment, even while we hear the heart and the soul of the architect in another place. So I wanted to kind of say, well, given and I'm going to try to hurry along because I know we're at 50 minutes. And thank you very much, Taylor, who really guided this and made this whole presentation of mine possible with his last minute helpful. Yeah. So, and discerning what character defining features are for a famous architect is apparently easy, right? You can go to almost any book on contemporary, on modern architecture and pull out a grab bag of what are the character defining features for a Neutra or a Schindler or something like that. Do you have aluminum louvers, which you can trace back to the Hall of Records and then back to the Kaufmann House? You have full height glass, you have aluminum paint on structural members, aka silver paint, broad overhangs, we're calling Frank Lloyd Wright, blah, 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 interstitial space. Then you can go a little farther. You can go, you can call out your spider leg. If you really know your stuff, you can call out about the suppression of the vertical on Neutra bookcases, the full height glass floor to ceiling. You've got, and you can just trot out your character defining features, and you're good to go. That's the easy part. What happens also with so-called famous architects is that sometimes we think we know so much about that architect that we start making mistakes. In a rehabilitation of a Neutra house in the Hollywood Hills, we came across very classic Neutra facade, right, with the strong whites and the so-called very cold Neutra brown. Thought, good to go, except the specifications in the drawings call out where there was a Neutra brown, there was a yellow. And at first I was taken aback, right, because Neutra didn't use yellow on facades. But if you do some paint analysis, aka getting a really good scraper, we found the original yellow underneath that so-called Neutra brown. Why? Because somebody thought that they could channel Neutra and that documentation really wasn't necessary. And here, of course, is the Claremont Methodist Church, another example of very well-known character-defining features in Anoitra, which is the use of asymmetry and the contrast, the very gestalt contrast between light and dark. So let's get to the problem, which is an everyday modernism. This is a house in Radcliffe Drive, not too far from here, by Ted Cryley. And we've seen some amazing examples of wonderful Ted Cryley already. But this, when we are confronted with this, that doesn't exactly speak like modernism, right? This is not canonical Catholic modernism. So we have to do some investigation. You know, this is maybe a hybrid. So we start looking at the building just by simple observation. And it might take 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 times spent with a building to get to know it and understand it spatially and with regard to its setting. Here I have, I think maybe I skipped one, I'm not sure. But we have the use of clear story windows on aspects of the facade, one of which is original here, one of which is not. But then the use of those industrial clear stories on the interior to borrow light. That's factor light, which is the same prismatic glass common to many mid-century modernists, and it was intended to dissipate light in such a way to make factory floors safer and therefore more productive, right? So that's one clue, that use of an industrial technology on the interior of a house. And then we can turn to the blueprint, and the blueprint might show us that there was a carport there, and that there was a strongly articulated solid void relationship between the carport and the house. That's been obliterated because people put in fences and boundaries that make it a monolithic, unarticulated facade. But you start to learn that by looking at the blueprints and getting familiar with the blueprints over time. Oops. And then we can use direct observation of the building to discover what the original paint colors were. If you go to the house now, it's a lovely shade of pink lavender, if you like that kind of a thing. But what the original color was a very lovely moss green. But again, it's paint analysis and the simplicity, the humility of actual physical documentation. This interior, again, looking at the blueprints. Whoops. Here, the blueprints show a very different kind of entryway. This was a built-out closet, but it was originally a full-height factor light bit of glazing. So again, the blueprints can be your friend and help me, who know very little. I mean, I've written a nomination on Ted Cryley, so now all of a sudden I'm a world expert. But no, I'm not. I have to step back and do the homework. And then it's more time with the interior, of looking at asymmetry, of looking at the very modernist idea of taking humble materials and using them effectively. In this case, cork, brick, factor light, concrete floor, which we're going to restore here so that it's a very moss green again. Again, the modernist idea of interstitial space, which is transitional between public and private and between indoors and outdoors. This is not original. So this was a glass planter whose outside was actually open to the air. Now, can we do that given contemporary needs for storage? Or can I convince the client? I'm not sure, but we can at least take it down so that we can experience more of the outdoors and have that a portion of that relationship restored. I'm never going to learn how to do this. Anyway. Yeah, so I just will conclude with the everyday is what we often live with. We don't always get thoroughbreds, pedigrees to work with. We have to find out what's interesting and important about everyday modernism. Thanks.
Yay. Any further questions? Several observations that I would like to make. One is blueprints are great, especially when they're really blue. Yes. But there's a classic thing, which is, was it built that way? And there's a famous, I think it was a Louis Sullivan building where they found the original doorknob design and pattern in the drawings, and the developer had more money than most people. Said, well, I want to redo the doorknobs, and they were told, no, it's not correct to do that. It's interpreting, creating a false sense of history, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to discern that. The other thing is, well, the blueprints were what was finally designed and is what we come to, but it may not be how it was actually built. Right. And that's where the investigation Barbara talks about, paint analysis, the scrapings, and the looking at what's there is critical. And then, of course, for a lot of buildings that, no blueprints survive, or it was never built off of blueprints, then the photo documentation of what you can see in the backgrounds of somebody's wedding or birthday party, and there's the house. And then you see it, and you just, as we saw by the trees in the Palm Spring Art Museum, oh, I know how those are in fact the original trees, or somebody spent a lot of money in bringing new ones. So.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much, because so much has to do with the permit record, or what you can document from the remains of what's inside, but that's a wonderful point, Taylor. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions from our esteemed panel? And we've been hearing a lot from the other side, and over here are just waiting.
I just wanted to sort of comment one more thing. The tricky thing about modern, especially more vernacular modern, is that they're very simple, and the simplicity is actually part of the character. So if you get a detail wrong, you can ruin it. So it's really important to take the time, as you pointed out, to actually understand the materials, to be able to date the materials, to know which materials. You really have to look hard and figure out, well, this is over here and this is over here and these things match, but this is out of place. So, maybe that's not original, and kind of figure out both. I think to really look and understand the materials, in addition to the documentation, in addition to other investigations, is so critical, and everything has to corroborate, and then you're right. And then just understanding then what is the design aesthetic, what was the design intent, which features are indeed the primary features, which are secondary, which are tertiary, where is there some flexibility for updating the building, and where do we really have to focus our restoration efforts. So to get to that point is a lot of work, but if you do it right, it can be really successful. So.
And in the end, you hope you're right more than that you're right.
Another area of this that is, I think, kind of interesting is that because the history of a building evolves. And so sometimes when you're looking back, you don't necessarily want to go too far back, because there might be something that happened, an addition or something that happened that could be considered significant now based on when it was done or who did it. And so it is in the details. It's like furniture design, where you can get around a furniture design patent by just changing a dimension very slightly. And so the same goes with buildings, I think. I live in a Criley house myself, and there are certain elements that you you kind of, when you see a few of the houses, and I think that's a good thing to do too when you're restoring a house by a particular architect, to look at his other work or her other work. And for example, Criley had a very specific detail in his door jambs, very specific. And he uses it, I've seen it in many of his homes. The paneling on the doors was also specific. So it's those little things that sometimes you can't always understand them just from one set of blueprints or one structure. You really need to explore and do some investigative, detective work.
Yes. Okay, anything else from you, Alan, since you're holding the mic?
No.
In the interest of time and economy, we're going to move to our last bit, but I want to add one other quote. When I read Barbara's points on style, there was a Charles Rennie Mackintosh quote, and we all know how much he inspired the modern movement. And the quote was, it was an old woodblock print that he had designed in his lettering that's hard to read. "There is hope in honest error, none in the icy perfections of the mere stylist." So with that, here we are in Pomona. Isn't that great? I'm not going to be the expert in malls here, although I know this was, it has design studies from 1967, but I believe the state's from 1962. The first sort of a change of the street, in this case 2nd Street, which is right along here, for 8 or 9 blocks worth. And then this is what is called a mixed mode system center, which we think means train station. And then that's the Pomona Mall. And then the Civic Center is in this area here, which when I was working in Pomona on a project, I got to go to the Civic Center. I had no idea that it was like that or it looked like that. This being the early 60s, there's the press this button and you can see where you are. So this is the epitome of the Jetsons, if you remember George Jetson complaining about his poor button pushing finger, which I do. Here we are with Millard Sheets, and he did numbers of sculptures here. So with respect to the previous conversations about Millard, this is one of the things of the many pictures that are in here that John sent to me, and also just quotes in general. This also brings up the question of conservation, which is back in 1962, this looked great, although it's black and white. It looks much less lively now with several generations of calcium deposits. The mall itself was one of the longest malls built in terms of being 9 blocks long. And you see what must have been opening day at the mall. And then in every successive photograph I've seen of this, it gets less and less populated. And they just took a normal street, 2nd Street in downtown Pomona. This is what they did, is they put in these concrete planters. This is showing a tree being dropped in a 4-foot box. And then those were all covered with stones. There was a question earlier about stones in modern architecture. Well, behind them is usually concrete in this case. But we also see that this had become, by who knows when these pictures were taken, but it did in fact get foreshortened by several blocks because people really didn't want to walk that far from where they could park. It was really popular. In fact, this is a little bit from Eugene, Oregon. The Pomona's Mall is so beautiful, it is nationally famous. So Eugene was thinking of using this. And in fact, Lawrence Halprin did a 1962 mall in Minneapolis. And oddly, in 1973 to 6, the downtown mall in Charlottesville, Virginia. Lawrence Halprin was basically a contemporary with the Pomona Mall. And both of them had great length that had been reduced in length. Just, I guess, because you would end up needing what this is, it says 5 cents a ride. And I'm sure that the nice ladies in there were on that tram a lot. But again, you have this how did you effectively gut the livelihood of this sort of mall by having transportation now being by foot or by 5 cents a ride cars? This was a newspaper article from 1978 with Ray Bradbury, noted author, talking about save the Pomona Fox Theater and do anything you can to get downtown moving again. Well, this was only about 15 years after the mall. And again, most of the pictures that you see in here look like, where did the people go? And of course, they went to other malls and places where they could park more conveniently, maybe. But inevitably, even when you have festoons over your entrance, it still doesn't help the fact that the streets are empty. And of course, this is what's the case now. What we have is some articles from different news outlets, Sarasota, Florida, and the Pomona cures its downtown blues with some modern art. That would be Mr. Sheets, we think. And then there is Mr. Sheets himself with some art that some local patron had bought on a trip abroad and talking about the fine art of mall building. I don't think this is what necessarily Mullard wanted to be known for, being a mall builder with fine art. But by 2003, the city of Pomona had declared, in fact, that this was historically significant. And most importantly, exceptional quality to qualify as historic landmark, because then they could control what could be removed. And as Margaret was saying earlier, it's very easy to remove particulars of home savings and loans. The one on Sunset Boulevard would be one example, where one day they had some murals there, the next day they were not. This would be the concluding shot, which might explain what didn't actually happen, which is I could only imagine that that is a people mover. So we can only hope that we will be, in fact, completing the design when the city of Pomona creates the mall. So with that, I give you the Pomona Mall. Here are the questions. What is this mall and why is it deteriorated, and why did they reduce its length from 9 blocks to 4 or 5 blocks? It's right by this transportation center. And how do you encourage people to go there? By having partial traffic or not, or what? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I did a little work on the Pomona Bank at one time. And I found out that the bank and the mall were designed at the same time. The mall was a way to integrate the bank into the commercial context, which I guess was one of the objectives of the program. And also around the same time, the Civic Center, the new modern government Civic Center, was being designed and built by Welton Beckett. There was a big effort to remake the downtown Pomona and modernize it. Not only was this bank done, but there were other modern banks built in Pomona at the same time, one by Kurt Meyer, in fact. So it was a remaking the whole face of Pomona at the time. So that's really why. I think the question really becomes, was the concept, how much of the concept was achieved, and then was it successful? I think that's really maybe what you're asking.
That and things like what happens when you don't have a people mover. You just really, if you think about this as being an airport mall, which is now they're all malls, they're no longer airports, then you get kind of closer to it. But it's also, what about this is a modern landscape, and what of this should be, and how can it be preserved?
Well, I think you have to look at significance, and I think, this was, I think it was considered the first mall in the West, and it was the longest mall for a while in the country.
I think that's right. But too long, as it turned out.
It also it was aesthetically integrated with architecture, landscape, art, and mosaic art and sculpture. And the landscape was both the local vernacular rustic materials along with a modern approach. So I think that it was both tied to the location, the sort of genius loci, sense of place, and also bringing that into the modern era. So I think that it does have a lot more significance, local significance, perhaps than one might expect. I think that it really has to be looked at as an integrated piece within the context of what was happening at the time, and you have to look farther than the mall itself to really understand it. And that was really what I found out when I studied it.
And that's the other point. When I was looking this up, the Civic Center is really quite far from that, but it has, it's like the Amundsen Pavilion and the downtown LA. It's a complete self-contained element. The mall, at least, you had, of course, all the cross streets that would interconnect, but the notion that the Civic Center was removed from that, I think, was sort of a curious master planning notion. I mean, the mall is the mall. The one in Charlottesville, when I was back to a reunion just last year, it's the most popular place to go, and not just for university kids. It's for the people from surrounding communities, which when I was there, it was where we called them rednecks, would drive in their cars and just do the cruise up and down Main Street. It's now incredibly successful and popular, and it terminates in a big civic auditorium, sort of open piece at the end. I don't have an image of it, but it's also long, and was sort of curious that this was reduced from 9 to, I think, 5 or 4 blocks long. But it still gets to the question of what of this do you preserve, and of course there's a conservation issue with the tiles, and especially with the travertine. But it's also kind of a curious indictment of the master planning principles that say this is how this should be done, and that the buildings in many of the cases, and you look at them, are really not a lot different from when they were first they were built long before the mall. And then this one I just included because it was one of those that was just, it was modernized, and this was what you would expect the mall to look like, not necessarily Woolworths with vertical blade signs and tall structures that were neoclassic. So it's sort of it's a mashup of contemporary design, modernized older buildings, and these kind of relentless planters, which as you go down the street, I mean, you see here the people mover, but back into this aerial view, there's sort of a relentlessness about it that you could imagine it was not that great a place to walk in the first place. So from a landscape component, how do you improve that? I'm looking at you for being the landscape voice in this, but what makes this more successful than not in terms of landscape? It's the fact that it's all hardscape, and that was one of the words that we heard, was that these concrete encased stones, a lot of those have been removed because the sort of removed places for people to sit down and interact and play. So it wasn't so much we needed to make it greener, it was that people felt that they did not have adequate public space in an area that's now everything, including public space. It's no longer cars, it's just a place for people. But then they began to question how much of this big urban structure, like Lawrence Halprin's work, inevitably has lots of built components.
And not so regimented.
Right.
Couple of points about this particular project. For Millard Sheath, I think this was a labor of love. This was his backyard.
Yes, he was born in
Millard, yeah, grew up in Pomona. And when we think about the art of Claremont, we really should make it the art of the Pomona Valley. Sam Ballou, for example, didn't live in Claremont. He lived nearby. people taught at Mount San Antonio College, at various schools in the area. So for Millard, this was really, from my perspective, for him, what can I do to help revitalize the city that I love the most? And, you know, whatever the merits or demerits of the project are, it was deeply personal for Millard. And in terms of historic preservation, the questions about Millard and the Claremont artists, what the work that was done there, and how much that should be worthy of preservation is quite important, it seems to me. The other issue that comes to my mind is demographic change. The Claremont art community, the art scene, post-war art scene, has certain cultural demographic characteristics to it that are not as good a fit today, probably, as they were at that time. So there isn't today, I would say, probably quite the same appreciation for these remnants, these cultural artifacts that Sheets and his cohorts created. You know, we've seen some of them work by Claremont artists who are featured in the documentary. So there's this question in the back of my mind: when the world changes, what do we do with valuable historical components that don't fit as well? Adaptive reuse only goes so far. We live in a changing world, and I don't know that people today in Pomona are going to warm up to the mall, even with a certain level of refurbishment, better plant material, certain changes in the structure, which is very severe, overly regular, I would say. But even changes like that aren't necessarily going to bring people back.
Well, they turned it back into a street.
In Pomona, yes, part of it.
You can park two-way street, and you park between the planters. Well, we're stepping way out here. I mean, a lot of planters are the way.
John, why don't you you have to use the mic, John.
No, it's mine.
I mean, if we can have the conversation, you know, where we can step aside for a minute from the, you know, automobile bad, pedestrian good, you know, automobile bad, pedestrian good. I mean, the reality is that it's an automobile environment. I mean, it's largely, yes, of course, you would walk from store to store and you would walk a block or two and so forth. But when you take it, everyone's always talking about, oh, well, you know, we have to create a pedestrian environment. We have to return it to a pedestrian environment. Well, I mean, not something specific, but we have to return ourselves to a pedestrian lifestyle and a pedestrian environment. And that's great. But if you're dealing with an infrastructure, which is an automobile infrastructure, admittedly, this is not a larger, longer, broader suburban strip with, you know, lower, flatter, horizontal, you know, drive-ins and coffee shops and supermarkets and that kind of thing. But it's still, that's my opinion, is that it's still about that. And I'm not saying, and Stephen, I want to look to you because you know more about the history of Fulton and Fresno, which I love, by the way, absolutely love it. But how successful historically it was from the beginning and over time and so forth. And now again with the returning, they did open it up to automobile traffic again, or partially, right? Okay. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm not sure, I don't have an answer, but I'm just saying I think that's a large part of it.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things I think that would really affect it would be looking at what those street trees look like 50 years later and taller and creating more shade. The other thing is what the program requirements at the time were and how they've evolved, because obviously they were trying to clear all vehicular traffic, and now what we have found out is the vehicle and the pedestrian have to coexist, whether it's even through mass transit, bus, whatever it is. And things that Lawrence Hallprint introduced, which were water elements that invited the pedestrian to linger, to play, those kinds of things. So I would say mall evolution has come a long way since those very primary pictures.
And you have behind you. One thing that, as I read into some of the malls in Lawrence Halprin's work, is that malls have or downtown pedestrian malls have a half-life or a shelf life of about 25 to 30 years, and then they get completely redone in some fashion. You know, bricks get replaced with concrete, or the concrete replaced by bricks, but they have a defined endpoint, which is not the case in a traditional townscape, where you'll just have individual buildings might go down and come up, but the general streetscape stays the same. Yes, Carol?
Yeah, it would be interesting to do a case study contrasting this with the Santa Monica 3rd Street Promenade,
Right.
where one of the things that has been done to revitalize the promenade periodically since it was originally a pedestrian mall is to manage the mix of commercial uses. And Santa Monica, which of course doesn't have the same kind of suburban environment as Pomona, decided that they wanted all the theaters in the city to be in that downtown area. And that brought a lot of pedestrian. At times they have emphasized restaurants. At other times they've not wanted restaurants and emphasized retail. And then of course, one of the things that was done was when the Santa Monica Place was built, they also established the farmers markets 2 blocks away to pull people out of Santa Monica Place. And so twice a week, there were farmers markets on Arizona. And I think you just look at a variety of other strategies in terms of how you keep an area like this vital. And the one thing that emerges today, you talked about the difference in generations. One of the things that's being discussed in the downtown community plan is the universal agreement that the scale and the historic environment of Santa Monica, of the promenade, at least in terms of key buildings, needs to be preserved, and the younger generation that are so much a part of our restaurant and pedestrian population are as enthusiastic about that as the older ones.
Right.
Okay, well, at the hazard of,
Since this is a case study, let me throw in one other consideration: homelessness, which is a major problem in Pomona. So to discuss all this in the absence of recognition of homelessness and demographic change is, I don't know, it's not complete. It's not a complete conversation, I don't think.
And if I could just add, this is not just an issue, I don't think, of urban design and landscaping or materials or whatever. It's an economic plan that it was needed here. And I don't think that was ever implemented. In Santa Monica, it seems that there was much more of a sense of that. So it didn't have so much to do with design, but much more the economic planning for it. That said, you know, Millard Sheets' elements here are just extraordinary public art, you know, nationally significant, I think. And so there's got to be a way to work those in, not rip them out like they did at Fulton Mall in Fresno, where they destroyed, you know, really wonderful art. So that's it.